On the 7th of December 1941, shortly before 8 in the morning, Japanese planes began bombing the American naval base of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The attack was sudden, swift, and deadly. Within minutes, several battleships were rendered inoperative, dozens of aircraft were destroyed on the ground, and more than 2,400 people lost their lives. The United States, until that moment uninvolved in the conflict, was immediately drawn into the war. However, this was neither an isolated nor a spontaneous event. The relationship between Japan and the United States had been deteriorating for years. Tensions over control of the Pacific, the economic sanctions imposed by Washington, and the military interests of the Japanese government created an increasingly unsustainable situation. For months, while peace was being discussed, an attack was being prepared. Warning signs existed, but they were not heeded in time. The story of Pearl Harbor does not begin with the gunfire, but with a chain of decisions and omissions that accumulated in silence. How exactly did it come to that point? Tensions that led to Pearl Harbor. The 7th of December, 1941, was not the sudden beginning of an isolated conflict, but the critical point of a series of tensions that had accumulated over years between Japan and the United States. The rivalry between the two powers intensified throughout the 1930s, fueled by conflicting interests in Asia and the Pacific. Japan, with an economy dependent on foreign trade, sought to control strategic resources such as oil, rubber, and minerals. Its military campaigns in China and Southeast Asia were aimed at that goal. However, its territorial expansion clashed with American interests in the region. Washington viewed each Japanese advance with increasing concern, especially after the occupation of Manchuria and the beginning of the war against mainland China. American authorities adopted progressive measures to restrain Tokyo. Trade restrictions were imposed, financial assets were frozen, and finally a total oil embargo was declared. This decision, made in July of 1941, left Japan with limited reserves to sustain its military apparatus. In the following months, both governments engaged in diplomatic talks. Japan demanded the lifting of sanctions without compromising its military presence in Asia. The United States, for its part, demanded a complete withdrawal. The positions were irreconcilable. Parallel to the negotiations, the Japanese High Command developed a plan to attack the American naval base in Hawaii. The goal was to temporarily neutralize the Pacific Fleet and gain the necessary time to consolidate its positions in Southeast Asia. The planning was kept secret, even while Japanese diplomats continued talks in Washington. The decision to resort to force had already been made. The question was no longer whether there would be war, but when it would begin. Yamamoto's secret operation. During the early months of 1941, the Japanese government evaluated options in response to the restrictions imposed by the United States. Within military circles, the idea of an armed action to secure resources in Southeast Asia gained strength. This decision required immediately neutralizing the offensive capability of the United States Pacific Fleet. The Japanese Naval High Command began to devise a specific plan against the Pearl Harbor base. The project was led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet. From the beginning, he maintained that if Japan went to war with the United States, it would be essential to begin the conflict with an airstrike that would disorganize its adversary on the first day of hostilities. The proposal faced resistance within the Japanese command itself. Some officers considered it unwise to attack a distant base instead of focusing on routes in Southeast Asia. Nevertheless, Yamamoto insisted that without an initial action of such magnitude, the Japanese effort would be at a disadvantage from the outset. His authority, combined with his prestige, swayed the decision in his favor. The plan was based on a naval operation with exclusive air participation. The use of ground troops or landings was ruled out. The objective was to launch a surprise attack that would destroy as many American warships as possible while they remained anchored. For this, intensive training of the crews was required, as well as a technical modification of the torpedoes, which had to operate in shallow waters. During the summer of 1941, a partial replica of the Pearl Harbor port was built in Japanese waters. There, constant exercises were conducted with torpedo planes, dive bombers and fighters. Navigation techniques, approach routes and launch timings were adjusted. The goal was to achieve absolute precision under real conditions. The forces selected for the mission formed a special unit. 6 aircraft carriers were assigned, accompanied by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and several submarines. This fleet would operate autonomously, maintaining complete radio silence from the moment of departure. Each commander received specific instructions and was informed of their role in the attack sequence. In parallel, Japanese intelligence services worked to obtain data on the routine of the Pearl Harbor base. They relied on the naval attaché in Hawaii, who sent coded reports on ship positions, air traffic, and activity levels. This information confirmed that weekends usually had lower activity and that the main battleships were concentrated on the island of Oahu. Strategists decided the attack would take place on a Sunday. The choice was based on the observation that, on that day, alert levels were reduced and most crews were resting. Furthermore, it was expected that a surprise strike under those conditions would generate greater impact and disorganization. The operation was discreetly named the First Attack Unit. It was established that it would sail in complete secrecy, following a route through the northern Pacific. The launch point was set at a calculated distance to allow the planes to attack and return without refueling. The calculation was based on the range of each type of aircraft. In case weather conditions or the element of surprise were lost before the scheduled day, there was an option to cancel the operation. The plan's success depended entirely on secrecy and synchronization. No second chance was foreseen in case of failure. The final order would be transmitted through a previously agreed code. The fleet would receive confirmation during its advance. Everyone involved was instructed to destroy any sensitive documents if they were detected or attacked before reaching the operational area. In mid-November of 1941, the final day for execution was set. The officers in charge informed their subordinates to prepare for a far-reaching action. No details of the objective were given until the last moment. The Japanese High Command feared that any leak could jeopardize the element of surprise. The planning of the attack on Pearl Harbor became a strategic priority. It was conceived as a limited action, intended to gain time to secure other conquests. No one in Tokyo believed that the attack alone would guarantee victory. The aim was to inflict enough initial damage to force the United States to negotiate under pressure. Heading to Hawaii undetected. On the 16th of November 1941, the Japanese fleet assigned to the attack on Pearl Harbor departed from Hitokapu Bay in northern Japan. It did so under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the 1st Air Fleet. The order to set sail was issued discreetly, and only the highest-ranking officers knew the final destination. The units deployed in a dispersed formation to reduce the risk of detection. The chosen route was through the North Pacific, an area with little traffic and unstable weather conditions. This choice aimed to avoid contact with commercial or naval vessels that could alert American forces. The fleet sailed without using radio, maintaining complete communication silence. Any signal emitted during the voyage would have compromised the operation. The advance was steady and coordinated. The units maintained a limited speed to ensure that all ships stayed in formation. Strict instructions were issued regarding the use of lights, noise control, and continuous horizon monitoring. Weather conditions were adverse, with strong winds and reduced visibility in several stretches, which aided concealment. Each ship received precise instructions on the maneuvers to perform if detected. If a vessel encountered a civilian or military ship, it was to change course or even sink it if it posed a threat to the mission's secrecy. This possibility was considered a last resort. As the fleet advanced, temporary checkpoints were established to verify positions and adjust the course. Meetings between officers were brief and strictly technical. No comments were shared regarding the objective or the next phase of the operation. The crew members knew they were heading into a military action, but they were not informed that the target was Pearl Harbor until shortly before the attack. During the journey, Japanese reconnaissance planes flew over the Pacific in search of signs of enemy movements. No American patrols were detected in the northern area, confirming that the route choice had been appropriate. On board the aircraft carriers, the pilots reviewed maps and target profiles. The priority was to achieve maximum effectiveness in the shortest time possible. On land, U.S. intelligence services maintained partial surveillance of the Pacific, focused on regions near the Philippines and Southeast Asia. The northern zone was not considered a likely corridor for an enemy fleet. This allowed the Japanese operation to advance without opposition or significant detection. On the 20th of November, the Japanese fleet reached the designated rendezvous point, still far from the Hawaiian archipelago. Brief launch drills were conducted without actual takeoffs. Sea and wind conditions were assessed daily to confirm that the attack date could be maintained. The forecast indicated stability for the first days of December. Simultaneously, support units, including submarines, approached the waters near Pearl Harbor. Their mission was to monitor the approaches and torpedo any ship that attempted to leave the harbor during the attack. These units departed on different days to avoid a visible concentration. Some small submarines were transported by larger vessels to the vicinity of Oahu. Coordination between the different groups was determined in advance. Each ship knew its role, timing, and margin of action. Signal exposure was minimized, and simple codes were used for potential emergencies. No communication with Central Command was expected once the operation began. On the night of the 5th of December, Japanese time, the final order was given to approach the launch position. The advance was carried out in tight formation, with units aligned to facilitate the simultaneous takeoff of aircraft. Squadron commanders made final adjustments to fuel, armament, and flight times. Instructions were confirmed in writing and left no room for interpretation. On the 6th of December, the Japanese fleet was already at a distance that allowed the attack to begin the following dawn. During that night, pilots received their specific assignments: primary targets, approach trajectories, flight altitudes, and return signals. No crew member left their post. The orders were precise and final. At the same time, in Washington, diplomatic and intelligence services continued to evaluate the situation with Japan. Encrypted messages were being received which, once deciphered, indicated that Tokyo was about to end negotiations. Despite this, no general alert was issued about the possibility of an imminent attack. The Japanese fleet completed its journey undetected. The deployment was carried out silently and with the planned coordination. The approach phase had ended. All units were in position. The next phase was to launch the attack in a synchronized manner on the morning of the 7th of December. Warnings ignored in the days before. In the days leading up to the 7th of December 1941, the United States received multiple signals that, when analyzed collectively, could have anticipated a Japanese attack. However, these signals were fragmented, misinterpreted, or ignored by the responsible authorities. The American intelligence system had resources to intercept diplomatic and military messages. One of its programs, known as MAGIC, allowed for the decryption of coded communications between Tokyo and its embassies. Starting in November, analysts began detecting an increase in activity through Japanese diplomatic channels in Washington. Despite this, it was not concluded that an armed attack was imminent. On the 4th of December, a message was intercepted in which the Japanese government ordered the destruction of sensitive documents in its diplomatic missions. This instruction was considered significant, but did not lead to a widespread alert. The officials evaluating the threat did not connect this order with a possible attack on military installations. On the 6th of December, during the night, the near-complete text of a Japanese message addressed to its ambassador in Washington was received. It announced the breaking off of negotiations with the United States. The content was partially deciphered before the attack, but it was not distributed with the required urgency. Some high-level officials did not receive the document until the morning of the 7th. Meanwhile, from the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur had reports indicating unusual movements at Japanese bases in Southeast Asia. These observations led to some preparatory measures, but did not result in direct coordination with the Pearl Harbor base. Authorities in Hawaii still had no specific warning of an attack. On the 7th of December, during the early morning hours, a radar located north of Oahu detected the approach of a large aerial formation. The system's operators reported the anomaly to the officer on duty, who interpreted it as a group of American bombers scheduled to arrive from the mainland. No alert order was issued. That same day, one of the destroyers on patrol near the entrance to the harbor detected the presence of an unknown submarine. The ship opened fire and sent a report by radio. The signal was received but was not treated with the necessary gravity. The message was not immediately shared with all commands. In addition to these operational signs, it was widely known that diplomatic relations with Japan were at their lowest point. Nevertheless, the attention of the American government was divided between Europe and Asia. The possibility of a direct attack on U.S. territory was not considered a priority. In the preceding weeks, reports had also been received from London and other Allied capitals, warning of a possible Japanese attack in the Pacific. These warnings suggested that the most likely targets were the Philippines, Singapore, or the Dutch East Indies. Pearl Harbor was not listed among the expected destinations. The military command in Hawaii had received general instructions about a possible Japanese aggression. However, they had no concrete data or dates. A regular routine of drills and patrols was maintained, but alert levels had not been modified. Aircraft were grouped together on airfields, which made them more vulnerable in the event of an attack. Some civilian and military officials, both in Washington and abroad, raised specific concerns in meetings prior to the attack. But those warnings were diluted among numerous reports and analyses. There was no centralized action to compile and synthesize the available information. Overconfidence in deterrent capabilities, the dispersion of the analysis system, and the lack of direct communication between agencies contributed to the absence of immediate measures. Each element, considered separately, was not enough to trigger a response. Together, however, they formed a pattern that clearly indicated the risk of an offensive. The 7th of December began like any other Sunday for the units stationed in Hawaii. No advance warning had been issued, nor had the defense of the naval base been reorganized. The warnings were not deliberately ignored, but they were not evaluated with the level of urgency the situation demanded. The lack of response was the result of a dispersed system, an incomplete reading of the context, and an underestimation of Japan's capacity to carry out a long-range attack. December 7th, First Wave. On the 7th of December 1941, at 6 in the morning, the Japanese fleet reached the designated launch position approximately 300 kilometers north of the island of Oahu. From the aircraft carriers, 183 aircraft began to take off in pre-established formations. The first wave included torpedo planes, dive bombers, horizontal bombers, and escort fighters. The leadership of the air operation fell to Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who directed the overall formation from his bomber. Each squadron had received specific assignments related to the primary targets. The torpedo planes would attack the main ships anchored at the naval base, the dive bombers would strike the airfields, and the horizontal bombers would focus on hangars and logistical buildings. The approach to Oahu was made at low altitude to avoid radar detection during the initial phase. Despite limited visibility due to cloud banks, the aerial fleet managed to maintain formation and adjust arrival timing. As they neared the island, pilots confirmed there was no significant air alert. At 7:49, Fuchida sent the attack signal via a coded transmission. Simultaneously, the first bombs began to fall on the airfields of Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, and Bellows Field. The intent was to disable the American air response capability before attacking the naval targets. In the opening minutes, the Japanese planes succeeded in destroying a large number of aircraft on the ground. Most American planes were lined up in open rows, making them more vulnerable. Many were hit before they could take off. American anti-aircraft fire was activated quickly, but its initial intensity was limited due to the units being in a resting state. While the airfields were under attack, the torpedo planes and bombers headed toward Pearl Harbor Bay. The main target was the battleships anchored in the so-called battleship row. Among them were the USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, and USS California. The torpedo planes, using torpedoes specially adapted for shallow waters, launched their weapons at low altitude. The ship's anti-aircraft defenses began to respond, but the attack achieved its first hits within minutes. The USS Oklahoma was struck by multiple torpedoes and quickly began to list. The USS West Virginia also sustained multiple hits, becoming severely damaged. Simultaneously, horizontal bombers dropped large bombs on the ships. The USS Arizona received a direct hit that struck one of its magazines, causing a massive internal explosion. The ship sank within minutes, taking most of its crew with it. The American response was immediate but disorganized. Crews that managed to reach their posts tried to activate anti-aircraft batteries, organize fire brigades, and rescue the wounded. Many sailors, caught by surprise while having breakfast or engaged in routine activities, were forced to improvise responses under attack. The first Japanese wave lasted approximately 30 minutes. During that time, Hickam Air Base suffered severe damage, with several hangars destroyed and numerous planes disabled. Wheeler Field and Bellows Field were also rendered nearly inoperative. In the naval area, the USS Nevada managed to begin maneuvers to leave the harbor, although under intense aerial attack. Other smaller ships also tried to reposition to make bombing more difficult, but most of the main units remained stationary, becoming vulnerable targets. Japanese commanders were evaluating in real time the level of damage inflicted. Initial reports indicated that the objective of neutralizing American air and naval capabilities in Hawaii had been achieved. Coordination among the different types of aircraft was maintained with precision despite the resistance encountered. The first wave returned to the aircraft carriers around 8:30 with minimal losses. Each unit recovered its planes according to the planned schedule. The pilots relayed their observations on the inflicted damage, information that would be used to adjust the second wave. Meanwhile, on the island of Oahu, military and civilian personnel were trying to organize rescue efforts, fire containment, and the extraction of those trapped in the damaged ships. The attack had been surprising, devastating in its execution, and had caused an immediate impact on the United States' defensive capability in the Pacific. Second airstrike on Oahu. Following the return of the aircraft from the first wave, the second Japanese formation began its approach toward Oahu. It consisted of 167 aircraft, divided into 3 groups. Their primary mission was to consolidate the damage previously inflicted, focusing on ships still afloat and on land targets that had not been fully struck. Aboard the aircraft carriers, technicians had been refueling and rearming the planes since 7 in the morning. The second wave took off shortly after 8:30. Each squadron was already familiar with its assigned target. The dive bomber group would aim for destroyers, cruisers, and other smaller ships. The horizontal bombers would once again target military installations, while the fighters would escort the formations to protect them from any possible takeoff of American aircraft. En route, the pilots received partial information about the events of the first phase. Although some ships had already been hit, several remained operational. Among them, the USS Nevada was attempting to leave the harbor, making it a high-priority target. The second wave reached Oahu shortly after 9 in the morning. The attack was divided among several locations. Over the naval base, the bombers focused on ships showing signs of activity. The USS Nevada received new hits that forced it to run aground near the harbor entrance to avoid blocking the exit channel. The USS Pennsylvania, which was in dry dock, was struck by bombs that damaged its deck and adjacent structures. At the airfields, Japanese aircraft attacked previously affected positions, ensuring that hangars and runways were left inoperative. Kaneohe Field, used by naval aviation, was targeted with repeated attacks. The number of American planes destroyed on the ground increased, further reducing the possibility of an effective air response. In this second wave, American defenses responded with greater intensity. The anti-aircraft units of the ships and land bases were already active. The accuracy of the fire improved, resulting in the loss of several Japanese aircraft. Even so, the squadrons maintained their course and completed most of their objectives before withdrawing. Conditions in the harbor were chaotic. Smoke from burning ships hindered visibility. Some smaller boats tried to move to clear space for rescue teams. The wounded were transported as best as possible to military hospitals. In several areas, communications were cut off, preventing efficient coordination. Japanese pilots observed that many of the ships hit in the first wave were still burning. The USS Arizona remained sunken, and the USS Oklahoma was still capsized. The USS Maryland and USS Tennessee, though damaged, remained afloat, partially protected by their location next to other ships. Japanese commanders assessed in the air the possibility of launching a third wave. However, there was no accurate information on the whereabouts of the American aircraft carriers, which were not in the harbor that day. This absence was seen as a shortcoming in the results of the attack, as the carriers were considered the most strategic targets. By 10:30, the aircraft of the second wave began to retreat. They had managed to complete most of their assignments. The loss of aircraft was higher than in the first wave, but remained within the margins anticipated by the Japanese High Command. No Japanese ship was damaged during the operation. Upon returning to the carriers, the pilots reported that the main targets had been hit and that the American defensive response had increased. The Japanese operational leadership decided not to order a third wave. They considered that continuing the attack could cause unnecessary additional casualties and endanger the fleet. On land, the attack had ceased, but its effects were visible across the island. The naval base, airfields and logistical installations had sustained significant damage. Fires continued to burn in several sectors. American military authorities worked to re-establish control and organize initial damage reports. The objective of the second wave had been to consolidate the damage and prevent any immediate response from the United States. The action was executed with precision within the established tactical framework. From that moment, Japanese forces began their withdrawal, still unaware of the magnitude of the response to come. Human and material losses after the bombing. At the conclusion of the second wave of the Japanese attack, the scale of losses at Pearl Harbor began to become evident. In the hours that followed, United States military units began an initial damage assessment. The figures were progressively adjusted as reports were completed and bodies were recovered. The number of deaths among military personnel rose to more than 2,400. The majority belonged to the Navy, with a high percentage of casualties concentrated on the battleships struck during the first wave. The ship with the highest number of deaths was the USS Arizona, where more than 1,100 deaths were recorded due to the internal explosion caused by a bomb that penetrated its deck. The USS Oklahoma added more than 400 deaths after capsizing from the impact of several torpedoes. The rest of the casualties were distributed among the USS West Virginia, USS California, USS Nevada, USS Maryland, USS Tennessee, and other smaller vessels. There were also victims on land, especially at the air bases of Hickam, Wheeler, and Kaneohe, where personnel were struck during the bombings or by subsequent fires. In addition to the deceased, more than 1,100 people were injured. Many suffered burns, shrapnel wounds, or injuries caused by secondary explosions. Medical units, both military and civilian, worked tirelessly during the first days to care for the affected. Makeshift treatment posts were set up in hangars, warehouses, and protected areas. In terms of the fleet, material losses were considerable. 4 battleships were sunk: the USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, and USS California. 4 others were damaged to varying degrees, though they did not sink. The USS Nevada was struck while attempting to leave the harbor, suffered significant damage, and had to run aground to avoid blocking the channel. Among cruisers, the USS Helena and USS Raleigh were hit. Several destroyers and auxiliary vessels were also damaged or rendered inoperative. In total, more than 20 ships were struck during the attack, some with serious structural damage. American aviation in Hawaii lost nearly 200 aircraft. Most were destroyed on the ground before they could take off. The planes were aligned in rows and exposed, which made them easy targets for the Japanese bombers. Very few aircraft managed to take off during the attack, and only a handful briefly engaged the enemy fighters. Ground installations were also severely affected. At Hickam Field, several buildings were destroyed or damaged. The same occurred at Wheeler Field and at the Navy's air stations. Communication systems suffered interruptions, and electrical services were affected by fires and explosions. Several fuel depots were destroyed, which complicated operations in the days that followed. The losses were not limited to the military sphere. Civilian casualties were also reported. Some residential areas near the bases were accidentally hit by anti-aircraft fire or secondary explosions. The exact figures varied, but several civilian deaths and an unspecified number of injuries were confirmed. The initial response by U.S. authorities was to establish priorities. First, rescuing survivors trapped in sunken or damaged ships was ensured. Then the wounded were transported to available hospitals. Fire containment was also initiated, especially on the USS Arizona, USS California, and several ground installations. In the days that followed, salvage operations were carried out. On the USS Oklahoma, divers worked for several days attempting to rescue sailors trapped in interior compartments. Some signals were heard from inside the hull, but in many cases the efforts came too late. The port infrastructure suffered considerable damage, though the access channel was not permanently blocked. This allowed for some level of operability and facilitated the arrival of support from the mainland. The runways, for the most part, were repaired in a short time, which helped restore part of the air capacity in the days following. Logistically, the United States Navy faced a significant loss of capital combat units, which altered its initial disposition in the Pacific. The absence of aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor during the attack prevented them from being destroyed, which would have strategic consequences later. However, the loss of battleships and the general state of the base represented an immediate setback in American military capability in that region. The inventory of human and material damage was compiled in reports sent to Washington in the days that followed. The figures were verified by special commissions. Despite the magnitude of the attack, the Pearl Harbor base was not rendered completely inoperative. Some units survived, and repair work began immediately. Immediate response of the U.S. Command. In the first hours following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the military and civilian authorities of the United States began reacting to the magnitude of the events. On the island of Oahu, the local command was temporarily disorganized, but was re-established with relative speed. The initial priorities were to prevent further attacks, rescue the wounded, and avoid major fires. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, and Lieutenant General Walter Short, responsible for Army defense in Hawaii, took immediate measures to reorganize the available units. Both officers had been caught by surprise, without prior information that would have allowed them to prepare an effective defense. During the morning of the 7th of December, they coordinated the activation of all still functional operational resources. Air and sea patrols were established to detect any potential new offensive. Planes that had not been destroyed were refueled, while pilots and mechanics worked to recover damaged aircraft. Coastal observers were deployed, and the preparation of permanent anti-aircraft defenses was ordered at various points on the island. In Washington, the attack was confirmed around noon local time through direct reports from the Pearl Harbor base and intercepted diplomatic communications. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was informed of the events by his military and intelligence advisors. Shortly thereafter, he convened his cabinet to assess the situation and define an immediate response. A state of emergency was declared throughout the territory of Hawaii. Additional security measures were activated along the continental Pacific coasts. The Navy and Army began mobilizing replacement units, and priority was given to sending medical personnel, engineers, and logistical supplies to the islands. Meanwhile, intelligence services worked to gather all background information prior to the attack. Intercepted messages, diplomatic reports, and internal memorandums were reviewed. The objective was to determine if there was any responsibility for omissions at the higher levels of command. In the following days, Congress received detailed information about what had occurred. Special hearings were organized to collect testimonies from key officers and those responsible for defense in Hawaii. The statements of Kimmel and Short were particularly scrutinized due to their central roles. Both were relieved of their positions a few days later, pending broader investigations. The War Department coordinated the deployment of additional units to the Pacific. Enlistment, training, and deployment processes were accelerated. The main naval bases on the West Coast began operating under maximum alert. Simulation drills were arranged in anticipation of similar attacks in other regions. On the diplomatic front, the State Department suspended all relations with Japan. Ambassadors were recalled, and diplomatic missions were closed. Japanese citizens residing in the United States were subjected to restrictive measures, including searches, surveillance, and movement restrictions. Days later, internments began in camps designated by the government. In the hours following the attack, reports were received of other Japanese military movements in Asia. The offensive had not been limited to Hawaii. Simultaneously, Japan was attacking the Philippines, Malaysia, Guam, and Hong Kong. This confirmed that it was a large-scale operation designed to alter the military balance throughout the Pacific. President Roosevelt maintained constant communication with top military leaders. The first drafts for an official declaration of war were prepared. Army and Navy high commands began designing counterattack plans and force reorganization. In parallel, the state of the war industries was evaluated to increase production in the following months. In the media, the attack was reported through official statements. The news was broadcast on radio and in the press with partial details at first. Information was updated as new reports arrived from Hawaii. The public's reaction was immediate. Spontaneous demonstrations occurred in various cities, accompanied by expressions of support for the armed forces. Major radio networks broadcast messages from the president and other officials. The public was urged to remain calm and cooperate across all sectors to confront the new situation. The general sentiment was one of outrage and unity in the face of what had occurred. Civil defense agencies began organizing training sessions, evacuation drills, and information campaigns. Communications between federal, state, and local levels were reinforced. The measures adopted in the days following the attack marked the beginning of a complete transformation in the United States' defensive posture. The official entry of the United States into the war. On the 8th of December 1941, in the early morning hours, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt went to the Capitol to request from the United States Congress a formal declaration of war against Japan. The attack on Pearl Harbor had occurred 24 hours earlier, and the scale of the damage was already known to legislators and the general public. The congressional session was convened as an emergency. The House of Representatives and the Senate met in joint session. The chamber was full, with the presence of senators, representatives, judges, cabinet members, and representatives of the armed forces. Roosevelt's personal attendance underscored the seriousness of the situation. The president read a brief message, precisely drafted by his team. In his address, he described the Japanese attack as deliberate, surprise, and coordinated. He detailed that not only had Pearl Harbor been targeted, but also other areas under American responsibility, such as the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island. The message emphasized that Japan had sent diplomatic delegates to Washington while simultaneously preparing the offensive. Roosevelt did not use emotional language or graphic descriptions. He maintained a firm and direct tone. He stated that the events constituted an act of war and that the United States must respond immediately. He concluded by requesting that Congress recognize the state of war between the nation and the Empire of Japan, with retroactive effect from the moment of the attack. After the president's address, legislators began the formal voting process. In the House of Representatives, the result was 438 votes in favor and 1 against. In the Senate, the resolution was approved unanimously. The sole dissenting vote was cast by a congresswoman who, although she condemned the attack, opposed any form of war on personal principles. Her vote did not alter the overall approval, nor generate significant debate. Once the resolution was adopted, Congress transmitted the decision to the executive. Roosevelt signed it immediately, and the document was officially published. From that moment, the United States was formally at war with Japan. The declaration was accompanied by executive orders to expand recruitment, reinforce industrial production, and increase the operational capacity of the armed forces. The news was broadcast across all communication channels. Radio stations interrupted programming to read the resolution. Newspapers published special editions with details of the legislative process. Post offices, railway stations, and public buildings displayed information posters with instructions for the population in case of mobilization or emergencies. Simultaneously, military units received preparation orders. The Army, Navy, and Air Force reorganized their commands, raised alert levels on all fronts, and accelerated training. Guidelines were issued to prioritize the deployment of troops in the Pacific and to coordinate the defense of the continental territory. In U.S. embassies in other capitals, diplomats conveyed the congressional resolution to respective governments. Political support and cooperation were requested to confront what was already considered an international conflict. In Europe, several Allied governments expressed immediate support. In Latin America, governments began re-evaluating their diplomatic relations with Japan. In parallel, the Treasury Department activated mechanisms to freeze the financial assets of Japanese citizens residing in the country. Measures were also adopted to monitor banking operations, postal shipments, and international communications. Searches began in ports, railway stations, and sensitive areas. During the hours following the declaration, volunteers began arriving at recruitment offices. Young people from various cities came forward to enlist in the armed forces. Universities, factories, and labor unions issued statements of support for the government. Civil defense organizations intensified their activities. The declaration of war on the 8th of December marked the formal beginning of the United States' direct participation in the Second World War. From that moment on, military operations progressively expanded, and the nation began to reorganize itself to sustain a global-scale conflict. Initial strategic repercussions. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor and the official declaration of war, immediate strategic consequences began to emerge for both the United States and Japan. The situation in the Pacific was rapidly transformed in the days following the 7th of December 1941. First, the United States lost the operational capacity of a significant portion of its Pacific fleet. Although several damaged ships were later recovered or repaired, their absence during the first weeks left a major gap in the defense of the Hawaiian archipelago and other island territories. The fleet's movements were limited, with no immediate capacity for large-scale counterattacks. The American aircraft carriers, which had not been present at Pearl Harbor during the attack, were designated as the new central axis of naval operations. Military authorities revised their doctrine to adapt to a war based on aerial projections from the sea. This reorientation required a reassessment of resource use and crew training. Tactically, the priority became the protection of supply routes to the Pacific Islands and Asia. Maritime and aerial patrols were increased, and the construction of new intermediate bases was ordered. Aircraft, munitions, and naval units were also produced at an accelerated pace in West Coast shipyards. The War Department reorganized its commands. Experienced officers were reassigned to new roles, and joint teams between the Army and Navy were formed. A unified command in the Pacific was consolidated, with structures aimed at more efficiently coordinating operations. A broader intelligence network was also established to prevent future surprise attacks. On the diplomatic front, the United States' entry into the war generated immediate reactions. Germany and Italy, in accordance with the pact signed with Japan, declared war on the United States on the 11th of December. The Roosevelt administration responded with similar declarations on the same day. This confirmed the global scope of the conflict. In Japan, military leaders evaluated the initial success of the attack as an opportunity to advance into other territories without direct opposition. In the days following Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces launched coordinated operations in the Philippines, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies. These offensives advanced quickly, taking advantage of the lack of an organized Allied response. The Japanese High Command maintained its expansion strategy in the weeks that followed. The objective was to consolidate a broad control zone before the United States could restore its offensive capacity. Temporary air bases were established, and key ports were occupied to secure supply lines. However, the absence of American aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor caused concern among some Japanese officers. The air fleet failed to locate or damage those units, representing a strategic oversight. This situation led to internal debates about the advisability of launching a third wave during the initial attack, which ultimately was not executed. In the United States, public opinion immediately unified after the attack. Expressions of support for the government and the armed forces were reflected in the surge of voluntary enlistment. Recruitment centers received record numbers of applicants. Industrial mobilization also began, with civilian factories converted into military production plants. Congress urgently approved budget allocations to expand the capacities of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. New taxes were established, war bonds were issued, and savings campaigns were promoted among the population. Universities and research centers began collaborating with the government on technological and logistical projects. American military authorities began planning a long-term offensive. An immediate victory was not anticipated. Plans were developed to establish forward positions in the Pacific, retake areas occupied by Japan, and eventually reach the main islands of the Japanese archipelago. Regarding the Japanese population residing in the United States, restrictive measures began to be applied, which would later lead to mass internments. The federal government authorized searches, account freezes, and movement restrictions. These actions were justified as security measures, although no sabotage cases by citizens of Japanese origin were documented at that time. The immediate consequences of the attack also reverberated internationally. Several Latin American countries broke diplomatic ties with Japan. Others, such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, declared war at the same time as the United States. The alliance map solidified, and the various fronts of the conflict began to coordinate according to common interests. The attack on Pearl Harbor, beyond its direct effects, produced a definitive shift in the structure of the war. From that moment, the Pacific became a central theater of operations, and the United States moved from a defensive posture to a strategy of sustained counteroffensive. The decisions made in the days following the attack marked the beginning of a new phase in the war. The attack on Pearl Harbor was neither an isolated incident nor an unforeseen event in its origins. It was the culmination of a series of tensions accumulated over years between two powers with conflicting interests in the Pacific. Japan made the decision to act through a precisely planned attack while diplomatic negotiations were still ongoing. The military execution, divided into two waves, achieved its immediate goal: to temporarily weaken the naval capability of the United States in the region. The consequences were immediate. The United States declared war the following day, and other powers gradually aligned themselves in the ensuing days. From that moment on, the conflict expanded globally with the active participation of new fronts. The war in the Pacific took on a total dimension, with far-reaching military, political, and strategic implications. The Battle of Pearl Harbor marked the formal beginning of this new phase. All the elements that preceded and followed it unfolded without interruption. The outcome was not sealed in a single day, but it clearly began on the morning of the 7th of December 1941.